Well, I got a few tips and photos and comments and some more stories here for you guys on this wonderful Monday morning. Beautiful, bright spring day outside, and I just love this time of year. Yesterday, I was over there doing some business in the town up the road, and I saw this beautiful 71 Monte Carlo park out there, and I said, wow, sometimes you just got to stop what you're doing, pull your phone out and take a picture. This guy, believe it or not, he parked his car out there and he left it running, and he went into the building that I was getting ready to go into. And when I walked by the car, the exhaust had a non-emission controlled smell to it, which basically, when you get used to the newer vehicles that have such tight emission controls on them, when you walk past a car like a 71 model, the only emission control component that was on this car when it was brand new was a PCV valve. And there may have been an air pump on there or something like that, but I think the air pumps didn't show up on there where they pumped the air into the exhaust runners. I think those showed up in 73, I think. But anyway, this thing had almost no emission controls in it. It doesn't take much time for the carburetor to get out of tune, and you know, as long as the customer's driving one and it seems to run to suit him and they can afford to buy the gas, they'll just keep on driving it. But it had some really stinking exhaust coming out the back of this beautiful car. But if you don't have those things tuned exactly like they're supposed to be, there's going to be some issues with that. And I could, like I say, when I walked past it and it was idling, I could smell that. And anyway, I told him, I complimented him on the car when I walked past him on the inside. But that was a gorgeous car. I saw this yesterday. Now I saw this one yesterday too. This is look. What do you see here? This is an old beat up Crown Victoria. That you can tell by the way the suspension has been modified, that they wanted to put some of those big wheels on it, and they probably had some on it at some point, and somebody had put the big wheels on it and modified the suspension to do it, and then apparently it got crashed at some point, just either damage up here in the front, and then they just put some regular old black wheels back on it. You know, it almost looks like a moonshine runner car or something, except it's you know, too bright of a color. You'd want to paint one of those a flat color and blink out the reflectors on the lights or whatever. But anyway, I saw this one out in front of the post office yesterday. I just had to snap a picture of that, and I always try to look into that and see what I see. Now this right here I thought was interesting. Here was an El Camino at the Ford place. Thought that was peculiar there, but he was obviously buying some parts for his broke down Ford. I don't know, but I saw that a while back, and I whipped out my camera and took a picture of that. I've got a camera that I carry with me just about all the time to take pictures, just for you guys, by the way. The pictures I take, all the pictures I take are for these videos that I make. Alright, this right here was on a Mazda B2300 that belonged to one of our maintenance men over at the college. He was a really good friend of mine. And he came in there and he was talking about how his starter was giving trouble, and he didn't know why. It just kind of started happening all at once. And he did not even know about the coolant leak that caused this stain right here. But that coolant that was running down here also kept dripping on the starter until it messed up the starter. So when I jacked it up and I saw this, not only did we have to replace the starter, but we had to fix the leak that was causing this. And it seems to me like there was some sort of one of those ridiculous plastic fittings that they had somewhere. I don't remember the details. This has been a while back, but I found this picture the other day and I wanted to pull it up because I did remember the context in which I took it. This 2300 2003 Mazda B2300, it was a nice truck. You know, Mazda started out, whenever they started building their trucks, they started out with, they were just basically a Ford Ranger with slightly different headlights and trim and stuff, and they had the same engine and all in them as the Ford Ranger did. And that started in 1993. But sometime later, now I will say that whenever they first, I may have mentioned this before, but the Mazda trucks, I discovered this by accident. I figured, I pulled a Mazda truck into my service bay, and it was, you know, open the hood, you're looking at a Ford, basically. And so I connected I disconnected the engine controller, and I connected the service bay diagnostic systems, you know, the big pinout connectors in between the engine controller and the harness. And I actually told it I was working on a Mazda and all that stuff, put in the VIN number for that vehicle and all that, and boy, that machine was so confused by that. And it turned out, as I did research, the injectors were wired into different cavities and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it turned out that all of the Mazdas back in that year model were California trucks, and the SBDS programmers didn't know that. Apparently, they just figured a Mazda and a Ranger were the same thing, which seems very strange to me since the SBDS machine came from Ford. But long and the short of it was that particular stain, when you see that coolant stain, even though it's a dry one, there's been coolant dripping on the starter. And we saw signature material like that on the starter too, so we popped the starter in there and got that guy going again. His engine was a different engine though, it wasn't a Ford engine, and he also had this little plug that kept popping out of his intake manifold, and it would make a huge vacuum leak, make it run terrible. And we found that the first time with Smoke Machine, and I sort of just glued it back in there, and it popped out again. But the place it popped out, it would just lay there. And so basically I cleaned it up a lot better and glued it in there better the next time, and it didn't ever change. He was driving this truck back over there close to in that rural area where he lives, and he saw some guy that was, in this part of the country, people are generally a lot friendlier than they are in some other parts of the country, not in every part. But he pulls over, he picks this guy up driving that same truck I'm looking at here, and so he said this guy, first thing he did when he got in the truck, he pulled out a screwdriver and he stuck it up to his neck, and he says he wanted him to take him somewhere, the guy that owned the truck that wanted to go. And he says, I said, okay. And he says, and while he was looking out the window somewhere and wasn't paying any attention, he says, he whipped out his little 380 pistol and held it up to the guy's head, and the guy dropped the screwdriver on the floor, and he stopped the truck and said, get out. And the guy says, can I have my screwdriver back? That was funny as all get out. That guy didn't know the guy that we was messing with though. But this VW automatic transmission standpipe on some of these later model Jettas and stuff, you'll see this whenever you have to, change the fluid in transmission. You got to pull that. That standpipe is vaguely similar to the one you're going to see in Fords and some of the other transmissions and all this that don't have dipsticks. But in order to put this and put fluid back in there, you take that standpipe out, and all the fluid runs out of it. And then you put the standpipe back up in there. There's a plug you have to take out to get to the standpipe, and then you got to use an Allen wrench to screw the standpipe out. When you screw the standpipe out, the fluid runs out. When you put the standpipe back up in there and tie it in place, you're actually going to take and pump fluid up through the center of that standpipe, and you're going to keep watching until you get it to the level above the standpipe where it runs back out that tube. And then whenever you've got the engine, the transmission has got to be warmed up. Let me say this too. A warm engine does not mean the transmission is warm. Heating up the transmission and heating up the engine, the heat will travel from the engine to the transmission, but it won't do it all that quickly, because where does most of the heat come from in an automatic transmission? It comes from the torque converter. If the torque converter is not actively working, it's not going to generate a lot of heat to warm up the transmission. It takes longer. But the transmission fluid has got to be at a certain temperature before you can get an accurate reading of how much fluid is in it, because the transmission fluid expands and contracts, and just like coolant does. So one way or another, you got to get it at the right temperature, and whenever it's trickling out that standpipe, and you get it, after you run it through your gears and all that, then you're going to put your little plug up that's going to stop up that hole and cover up the standpipe. And so that was one of the things we had to do on that. One of the things that was also funny about this same guy's vehicle, this guy was a Volkswagen. He was a science professor at the other campus over there, and he came over there. He would buy this kit to change the oil in his vehicle, and I liked the guy, so I'd let him just kind of piddle around and help the guy. And the kit that he would buy to change the oil always came with a brand new drain plug. I didn't know about this at the time, because we just started working on that particular Volkswagen. And we also had to put an airbag clock spring in that thing because of something that was going on. I can't remember what it was on that. We managed to find one of those and change it. But anyway, one day after he had left on his vehicle and he had headed back over to the other campus, and I didn't even know he was buying these kits, I look at the oil drain thing that you put air pressure in to push the oil out of it and all. There's a little tray on top of it where you can put stuff when you're changing the oil. And I saw his drain plug laying there, and I recognized it as the drain plug from that Volkswagen, and that scared the daylights out of me. And I called him up and said, "Oh no, I see a drain plug here." And he said, "Well, no. He said a new drain plug came with the kit, and I replaced the drain plug, and that's why the drain plug's laying on top of the thing." And I was like, boy, that's the scariest thing in the world, is to see a drain plug laying there after somebody has left on the car. Of course, why wasn't there a lot of oil on the floor? I don't know, but that was just real spooky. And sometimes I've seen that some of these doofy guys that aren't used to doing a lot of oil changes, you got to watch them really close if you're teaching people to do oil changes. because they'll fool around occasionally and they'll forget to pour the oil in and try to start the vehicle up. And one of the things that annoys me about that is I've actually seen it happen a couple of times, and I yell at them and they shut the car down instantly as soon as they start it. You know, just by the grace of God that I wasn't on another part of the shop, and they started up and locked the engine up or something. And I'd say, shut it off, and they shut it off, and I'd say, you didn't put the oil in it, the oil's still over here on the bench. And every time they do something like this, it's real serious, they laugh about it. And I don't understand this laughing about it when they were that close to causing a major disaster from being goofy. Anyway, these STP stickers used to be all over the place. There was one of them on the door of the bathroom door over there at the college, and of course the college has been there since 1965. But anyway, that particular sticker was on the door, and I bet it's still on the door now. Somebody hadn't scraped it off right. It's probably been on there for 40 years, you know. But those STP stickers, if you older guys will probably remember those. Everywhere you looked in any kind of a shop or on a lot of people's cars, you see these STP stickers on the glass or on the bumper or somewhere like that and all. Well, this is kind of a funny bunch of little happenings right here. Chrysler required somebody to go and take electrical because they bought the Jeep franchise. We bought the Jeep franchise from the local dealer who was going out of business. We got the Jeep franchise at the Ford dealer, and so I had to go to, I've been to Jeep schools in Atlanta, 6 or 7 times in 1 year. It seemed like I've spent more time in Atlanta than I did working in my service bay. All right, so then Chrysler bought Jeep. You might remember that Daimler Chrysler bought Jeep, and so I wound up going to Louisiana to a school down there because somebody had to be certified in electrical school from Chrysler, and then these manufacturers like that. Well, I'd already been to electrical school with Volkswagen, with Mazda, with Ford. I mean, I'd been several of those, and also with Jeep. But I went up here, went to that school for Chrysler and all that. It was a very interesting experience. It was a school I'd never been to before. Nice facility down there. They sent me for a 2-day school to get Chrysler certified. I went down there, and I was wearing this uniform when I showed up the night before, and I changed out of it into some street clothes because I was told this was going to be a 2-day class, right? And so I just brought enough clothes for a couple of days, and brought enough money for a couple of days and all that, and I was like 6-7 hours from home. And so I said, well, the guy in the classroom, when he started talking, he says, okay, on day 1 we're going to be studying this, on day 2 we're going to be studying this. And whenever he kept counting off the days on his finger, I said, wait a minute, I was told by my service manager that this was a 2-day course. He said, no. He said, this is a 5-day course. So I can't cover this in 2 days. You're going to have to be here for 5 days until noon on Friday, Whew. So I had to call my wife and tell her, I thought I was going to be gone 2 days, but I'm going to be gone 5 days. So then I had to call the service manager and say I need, credit card, or, they didn't give me a credit card. They gave me a cash for a couple of days, and that's kind of the way we did it back then. And so he called the hotel and he gave them the credit card number, and he says, make sure he's got everything he needs to eat. This is for every day of the room that he stays and all that. And so the thing about it is, I had to wash my clothes, and I had to, had to do laundry every night. And so after I did my laundry, I had to put these uniforms. This may not have been the uniform I was wearing, but it's one like this. There's about 6 patches down this side. My service manager was a big proponent of putting patches with your credentials, for your Ford training and all, and ASC and all this on the other side, and I had an American flag over there and this kind of thing. You've seen some pictures of me in my uniform. But anyway, the point is, I went up there. There's 12 guys in that class, and so I just kind of sat there, with everybody else and listened to this guy, do this basic teaching and that kind of thing. Okay, so one of the things I didn't really like about this instructor is he had a foul mouth, and when he wanted to get a chuckle out of the guys in the class, he would throw an F-bomb in there, and I just, if somebody wants to use an F-bomb, that's their business. But when Chrysler later sent me a questionnaire saying, what did you think about the school you went to? I says, I don't like the language this guy uses. He's not representing Chrysler very well. And even, the Ford place I worked at was Bondi's Ford, and he kept calling it Bondage Ford. And I was thinking, this guy right here, he really needs his mouth washed out with something. Young guy, I don't think he'd ever fixed a car. He seemed fairly knowledgeable about the stuff he was teaching. But one of the guys who was training to be a Corvette instructor for GM, no, excuse me, I'm sorry. He was a Corvette mechanic, but he was training to be an instructor for Chrysler, and he was sitting in the class auditing it for that reason. He was a young fella too. And he was talking about those lights that switch back and forth. I've got a video on my YouTube channel about these alternating lights, like when you turn on your park lights and turn on the turn signal, the side marker light and the turn signal light will alternate. But whenever you turn off the park lights, they blink together. Okay, and so this guy, there was nobody in the classroom but the guy that was auditing the class and me and the instructor. And so that guy asked the instructor, how do they make these lights alternate like that? And I said, well, I mean, the instructor blew him off because he really couldn't answer it. And I said, I know how those lights do that, and I'll draw it for you on the board if you want me to. I mean, I wasn't trying to embarrass the instructor, but I knew the answer to the guy's question. So I got up there on the board, and I drew how it worked. Now, you can go on my YouTube channel, and I think if you do a search for the word alternating, you'll see a little short, very, very short video I made explaining how that works. And it's not complicated at all, but he basically caught the instructor flat-footed because he didn't know how to answer the question. And I just quietly showed him how it worked. He goes, oh, I see now. That makes sense. And so, anyway, that was over with. Well, something else the instructor did that I thought was really wacky was when he was talking to us in there about heat and resistance and all that, he tried to make the case that resistance does not create heat. And everybody in that class, all the other mechanics, nobody wanted to take him on, but they were all rolling their eyes. You know, about what in the world is this guy coming from saying resistance doesn't make heat? He was trying to tear down something that was a baseline principle. If you've got resistance in an electrical circuit and current's flowing, you're going to have heat there. That's why they make, and I even asked him this, why do they make resistors out of ceramic if it doesn't make heat? If you didn't, you know, if resistors didn't need to be made out of ceramic to handle the heat, you know. So anyway, I kept pressing him on that until he finally backed down and finally admitted, well, I guess resistance does make heat. He hadn't thought about it. He said, why do connectors melt when there's resistance there? There's always heat. I mean, that was just a strange situation and all that. But anyway, that was all of the stories I had on that. And when I got through the class, I went back home. I will tell you this, though. I've never, in my entire career, I've been to a lot of electrical classes. Every single time I go to an electrical class, I learn something I didn't know, or I get clarification on something that I kind of knew. And you know, you might think, well, if you understand all the stuff about electrical, you'll know it all and all that kind of stuff. But there's so many different ways it can be taught. There's so many different tricks you can do. You might remember the little thing I was talking about, using an old TV remote and hold it by your antenna and hook a wire from the shorted part of a circuit to the radio antenna and put the radio on the low end of the AM band, and then when you mash that remote button, it's poorly shielded, and so it'll make noise in the low end of the AM band. That's the most sensitive end of the AM band. Back in the Vietnam War, they used a low AM band radio to tell these guys if they were being painted by radar so they could dodge surface-to-air missiles from the North Vietnamese. But anyway, the point is, if you go down there pushing the buttons on this remote with that thing, with the radio on the low end of the band, pushing buttons on your remote, and you come to the short where it's touching the body of the car, you'll get a lot of more interference in that spot, and you can use it for sort of like a short finder, you know. But I learned that at that school. I had kind of heard about it before, but they demonstrated it at that school, and it was really cool. But you got to have an old TV remote for a crappy old TV in order to do it. I'm not sure a new TV remote would do it all that well. This was a funny little meme that I made. You been sparking right lately? Usually, but sometimes I drop out under load. Two spark plugs talking to one another. That's not. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one, but you see the point on that. I just got a good clear picture of them plugged like that when I took that. Now this right here, I got to briefly revisit this Acura Vigor. To begin with, this guy that I know really, really well, he's a sort of a relative distant, you know, by marriage and all. He bought a 93 Acura Vigor for $4,400. It was a mom and pop car that only had 130,000 miles on it. And what he didn't factor in was they'd been driving it short distances and they'd sludged up the engine on the inside. Okay, so he drove it on a trip. I mean, a week after he bought it, he drove it on a trip. And he got it really, really good and hot, and it stayed hot. And all of this sludge from the inside of the engine started to melt and go down into the oil pan, and finally it got to the point to where it clogged up the screen, starved the engine for oil, and it locked the engine up. And he's only owned the car for a week, so he had to spend a bunch of money, I don't remember what it was, a couple of $1,000 getting the engine replaced. Well, on that particular one, you see the engine, this right here, all of this had to be taken out. See how the output shaft from the transmission comes out in the same direction that the input shaft went in, and it goes in here. And this is the final drive. And it's a front wheel drive, but it's a north-south engine. You understand what I'm saying? 5-cylinder. Okay, so anyway, this was all changed out. Okay, so all fine and good. They drove this car after the motor was swapped out for a little while, for I don't know, probably 3 or 4 months. I don't know what it was. They put some miles on it. And then one day he went to drive away from the gas pumps and it wouldn't go. It just sit there, and he could hear noise coming from the transmission area. What happened was, when the people swapped out the engine, they did not put grease in these splines. Now you notice there's a seal there. It's supposed to keep salt splash and grease, and the water and all out of there. They did not put any grease at all in these splines, and you can't see it really good in this picture, but the splines on that shaft that go in here got rounded off. Well, with that like it was, I didn't want to take this apart and replace all that. We found him a transmission that was a replacement transmission, a used one, and it came with a torque converter and all, and we actually had to buy this final drive part too. Now that wasn't part of the engine, but you had to take it out of there to pull the engine out, then pull the transmission, and you pull the motor and all that. So we had to replace this assembly here, and we had to pack that full of a lot of grease, and then whenever we slid all this in there, those splines went in there, and they drove that car a long way like that before somebody crossed the median and plowed into the side of it and totaled it out. But anyway, that was a grand adventure right there, and it's really the only one of those I've ever seen or worked on. Cadillac Eldorados had a north-south orientation and a transaxle and all that, but then they had a differential chunk up in the front. This one here was just very strange the way it was put together. All of that stuff had to come. It didn't go out the back; it came right back out the front. That was the craziest design. Well, another little short story. I had talked to somebody, somebody at the tire store one day was talking about how much better Japanese cars are, and I said, well, let me ask you a question. I said, what if you had 2 cars parked side by side? One of them was a 95 Ford Taurus with 180,000 miles on it, and the other one was a 93 Acura that had 130,000 miles on it, and let's say they were both the same price. Let's see, which one would you buy? Or let's say the Acura was a little more. Which one would you think would be the better car to own? I thought, oh man, I'd buy that Acura hands down. That's got to be a better car than that Taurus. I said, well, let me tell you a little story. And I told him about this guy that I know that bought this car, drove it a week, had to put a motor in it, later had to have all this other work done on it. I said, that's what you get when he bought that Acura. Now, I said, this is anecdotal. You can look at a whole lot of other information, gather more data and all that. I said, but the Taurus that I sold my son had 180,000 miles on it when I sold it to him, and it never gave any trouble to speak of. It actually wound up having to have a vehicle speed sensor one time, and I put some plugs in it and one thing like that. I said, I sold it to my son with 180,000 miles on it. He put another 100,000 miles on it, and then when he traded the thing in over there at the dealership, they told him there was nothing wrong with it. I thought that was very interesting, and it had nearly 300,000 miles on it. It was running like a sewing machine. It didn't give near the trouble as Acura did. Okay, I used to love these old bugs. You might remember this Wilt Chamberlain commercial, that old bug there. It's like I think that's a '66 bug or something like that. And this old bug sitting beside the road. A lot of people like to fix these bugs up. They really do. And it's just pretty slick. But I see that one like that, I said, somebody that really knew what they were doing, and my dad had a bug shop for long years. I've mentioned that before. And the thing about these bugs is the brakes had to be adjusted regularly. The valves had to be adjusted regularly. You change the oil every 1,500 miles. They did not have a oil filter on them, not when they came new. That is, you'd pull a little plate out from under the middle of the engine under there and clean out the this little screen under there. They had an oil cooler that was in this humped over blower housing. They had a blower on the back of the generator, and they still had a generator for years. Even after everybody else went alternator. And in the later models, they actually turned that into an alternator. But they actually would, it was a belt-driven generator, obviously, and on the back of it was a fan, and the fan would blow through that oil cooler, and that basically the oil is a lot of what cooled the engine and all that. So anyway, this my friend Charles, the farmer. I mentioned this story I think one time before. I can't be sure if I mentioned it or not. This looked exactly like the truck that he drove. He was driving at the time. And he came to my house one morning, knocked on the door about about 6 o'clock in the morning. It was on a Sunday, and he asked me if I could go get his irrigation engine started. And it was like a 455 Oldsmobile engine that was, had points and all in it. It was down there by the pond, standing in the weeds and all that. It hadn't been started all winter, and he needed to irrigate his peanuts. And so I said, yeah, I guess I can go down there with you. So he loaded me in his truck, and we took me off down there to the pond. We ran the wasps and the rattlesnakes away from the darn thing, and I put plugs and points in it, which he'd bought those, and everything. And then the oil had come off the cylinder wall, so it was going round, 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 how it does like that. So I hooked it. I unhooked one side of his battery and did a trick my daddy always used to do, and hooked it up 24 volts and spun that thing really fast and got it fired up and just throwing water everywhere, and it ran real smooth. And so got it. It took me probably a couple hours, and so I'd known this guy all my life, so that's why he felt comfortable knocking on my door at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning. And so when he took me back to the house, he says, how much owe you? I said, $20, I guess. And I could tell he didn't like that, so he gave me the $20. And about 3 or 4 days later, his car, his old little pickup was sitting beside the road with the hood up, and he was trying to figure out what was wrong with it. And I said, you want me to stop? I stopped, and I said, you want me to help you with your truck? No, I can take care of it. It's all right. And I said, oh, you can't fix this truck. Let me look at that. And bad connection ignition switch or something. I got in there and fooled around with that, got it fixed, boom, fired it up. So he fixed his glasses, put his hand on his hip, and said, how much I owe you? And I says, when I stop to help you, you don't owe me anything. But when you knock on my door at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, you're going to pay me something, And then I said, did I charge you too much for that irrigation motor job? He goes, well, you charged me enough. This guy's probably gets $100,000 a year off of his crops. And he had plenty in the bank he had never seen, and big long chicken houses and all that. But it's amazing to me that growing up in the country, whenever people find out that you're a mechanic and you know how to fix stuff, if they're people that grew up knowing you, then they feel like that you should do the work for free or almost nothing and just let them pay for the parts. And like that, and I love farmers, and farmers feed us and all this, but there are some farmers, or really get ticked off if they feel like they got to pay anybody for labor to do mechanic work on their stuff. Now, not all of them are like that, but I've known some that were. Anyway, that was a funny one. That truck looked exactly like the one he had, and those trucks were everywhere back, in the 70s and 80s, Now, these DPFE sensors on these Fords, one of the things that I used to tell my students, I would open the hood and I would say, show me the EGR valve and do not point at the fuel pressure regulator, because they would see a little diaphragm with a vacuum line going to it, and they'd think that was the EGR valve without even paying attention to what it was connected to, I don't know how many times I saw students do that. Well, this one right here, when you go into that wire, you have signal return, and then you have reference voltage in the wire, whatever color it was. I think it was brown with a white stripe or something. I can't remember it. I've slept since then. But the point is, you go into the wire that's the signal wire, you'll see 0.6 of a volt on the metal one. On the plastic one, you see 1 volt. And this is the feedback sensor that basically tells the computer how much EGR is flowing, so it can use a little solenoid to operate the EGR valve via this vacuum line, and it can, give it the amount of EGR it thinks it needs and all that. But I started measuring voltage on those darn things, and I could fix them with a whole lot more precision by measuring voltage. So I sent a best ideas letter to Ford. Entered the contest. I won a $100 prize and got a little plaque for that. And I told them measuring voltage is the best way to test for sensors. Some of the old procedures would have you unplug the sensor and measure the ohms of the sensor while the engine was running. I thought it was the dumbest thing I ever heard of. All you had to do, I started measuring voltages, and I got a real sharp, I put a little wire with an alligator clip that I hooked to one end of a long coat hanger that had a piece of heat shrink tubing on it all the way down to the very end. There's a little point I put up, sharpened it on a grinder, and I would very gently go into that wire and measure voltage on all those sensors, one at a time. And I measured all those sensors. I got used to what they were supposed to be on all those Ford cars I was working on. And I started measuring voltage, and I started fixing cars left and right. That manual, they originally called it the H manual, and then later they called it the PCED, Powertrain Control Emission Diagnosis or whatever. The initial H manual, it would lead you in circles and you wouldn't fix nothing. And so I threw that thing on the shelf after I tried to use it for about a week after I came back from school. And I started checking voltages and everything, and I was fixing, 10, 12 cars a day, turning off check engine lights, getting rid of skips and all that kind of stuff, black smoke and everything. But anyway, they started, the next year, they changed the procedures in the Ford shop manual and had us measuring voltage on all the sensors. And they were giving us little windows and stuff like that. I thought that was pretty interesting. Fuel alcohol test review. This is an alcohol test a student was doing when I was teaching them on that. If you put, see the graduated cylinder, you can buy these. If you put this gasoline in there, you fill it up 90, and then you put 10 milliliters of water in it, right? Up to that one. And then you shake it up. Whatever it gains, because the water and the alcohol will mix easier than the gas and the alcohol will, so you're going to actually gain some water because that alcohol is going to bond with the water, and whatever this is will be the percentage of alcohol is in there. It's really important to do this because an engine that's not set up to run off of like E85, these E85 vehicles can run off of up to 85% ethanol, but if somebody uses that E85 in a vehicle that's not set up to run E85, sometimes you'll find 50-60% alcohol fuel in there because somebody squirted that stuff in there and the engine's running horrible. And you can spend a lot of time and energy trying to find out what's wrong with the motor if you don't find out that you've got good fuel that's not contaminated and doesn't have any water in it. I told you all about this Dodge truck the guy filled up, and when he pulled in there, he said, I filled it up, drove it a couple of blocks, it wouldn't start. And we actually energized the fuel pump and let the fuel pump every last bit of the fuel out of that. It only had like 6 or 7 gallons in it, so it took a couple of 5-gallon buckets to do it. Found no water in there, tested the fuel, found no alcohol in it. The fuel even smelled good and all that, but that truck would not start until we put a fresh load of fuel in it. And the data that we gathered from him on I filled up the truck and it quit before I went 2 blocks was what sent us to looking at the fuel. But imagine if a vehicle like that comes in as a no start and you're trying to figure out what's wrong with it and you don't have any idea that it's got fuel in it that's no good, right? Okay, so you're going to go all over the place around Robin Hood's barn, probably change a lot of parts and do a lot of unnecessary work. I always like, if I've got a screwball situation like that, I always like to check and make sure that it's got good fuel in it. Take a fuel sample, in extreme circumstances, pump the tank out and see if you can see any water. See, if you pump the tank out, if it's got water in it, you're going to see water showing up in that. You got to have a nice clean container you're pumping it out into so you can see it, and you got to have one that will hold the amount of gases in the tank. If you only got a 5-gallon bucket, we had a tanker that we used to pump the gas out, pump it back in, but we don't want to contaminate our tanker, so I'll let us pump it out into these other buckets that we had. Now you do need to be able to put lids on the bucket so there's not a lot of vapor floating around in the air and all that, because you could set fire to something, and obviously there won't be anybody smoking in the shop anyway. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you don't have good fuel, you might remember the other tale I told about the Taurus that came in there, and it was running, it was hard to start. If you could ever feather the gas and get it warmed up, it would run like a spotted ape. I mean, this thing would absolutely fly, and it actually would ping a little bit. This is nearly a brand new car, 3-liter. And when I went to check the compression, it had a 210 pounds on every cylinder, and an ordinary 2-valve Taurus like that one at the time only had 160 pounds, about that, when it was brand new. This thing had 50 pounds compression more on every cylinder than it was supposed to have, and it turned out it was a bunch of diesel fuel in the gas. Some knothead that had rented the car had filled it up with diesel fuel. Now I don't know what the ratio was, but the long and the short of it was, I mentioned this story to some of my students, and the first thing one of my students did was he went and put a bunch of diesel in his truck. I mean, to see if he could make it run better. That's the craziest thing I ever saw somebody do. Anyway, finding out how much alcohol is in there, I think the president was talking about, making it E15. In order to make enough alcohol to fill up the tank of a SUV, something like an Expedition like that, the corn it takes to make that much alcohol would feed a family for a year. I don't even know why they're even talking about doing that, but the simple fact is, alcohol does not get the same kind of, doesn't have the amount of energy in it that gasoline does, and so it's going to have to be, the mixture's got to be different and everything else, and that's why they have these fuel composition sensors and stuff like that, so that whenever you're putting E85 in there, it can actually calculate the parameters for the engine controls based on how much alcohol it sees in the fuel. And if the fuel composition sensor is lying to it, it won't figure that right, and you'll have trouble with that too. But these trucks that are built to run on, trucks and cars that are built to run on the alcohol will have a better fuel pump and better fuel system, because alcohol is corrosive. They have to build the stuff out of, they got to build the elements of the fuel system out of better stuff. So if you buy an E85 vehicle, you're getting a better fuel system than you're going to get buying one that's just made to run gas and all. Anyway, I hope I made that clear enough to where you can understand what that was about. Now, there's an injector versus ignition pulse. Notice the spike. This is a 50-volt spike, and this is actually measured right here. So the voltage that you're getting right at this point is coming through the injector and going into the scope, and you got 12 volts reading right here, right? And this is 50 volts usually. That was a 40-volt scale, and it may not always be 50 volts, but that's my rule of thumb voltage for that. But anyway, long and short of it is, this thing right here, whenever this PCM closes that injector and it pulls that down to 0, the whole time that's down, fuel is spraying out of the injector. Now this is only a little bit of, see, this is a 10 millisecond division, so you can tell with this 10 milliseconds, you see. And well, actually, this 40 volt is, there's 40 volts here and another 40 volts there, so that is about 50 volts. I was a dumb butt. Oh, sorry about that. But anyway, this one right here, 10 milliseconds division, you can tell what this is. You can actually watch that while you're spinning it over and see what it's doing with the pulse width and that kind of thing. When it releases the injector, though, that spike happens because the magnetic field collapses across the injector winding, and it almost acts like an ignition coil. And so you got about 50 volts is popping out of that thing, and so the circuits in the PCM that are made to operate this are built to withstand that voltage spike that comes back out of there. Now this is a secondary ignition pattern, and it looks different, but see how that one there, whenever it's held down, and whenever the point's open, if you will, or the magnetic field is collapsing in the coil, you get a 10,000 or 20,000 volt or whatever. You know, if you pull the wire, it may be a 60 to 80,000 volt spike or whatever. After it jumps, this right here is the firing. This is the firing voltage. This is the spark voltage. How much it takes to keep the spark burning, and that upkick right there is because it ran out of fuel. And after the spark burns out, it goes, it snaps like a rubber band. If you don't have a bunch of these squiggles at the end, then you probably got a weak ignition coil, or a problem with the voltage feed to the coil or something like that. But let's look at this. Primary versus secondary ignition. You don't have to measure primary ignition to do your troubleshooting. This is you don't have to measure secondary. This is the big spark that's coming out here, right? That's measured with an inductive probe around your spark plug wire. That's where you're getting this pattern right here. This one, on the other hand, is actually being measured right there at the primary side of the coil. And so this is like a 400 volt spike. It's going to paint the same picture, and it's slightly different. You can tell there's a little, it's very, very similar though. Anything you can find looking here, you can find looking there, because if you pull a spark plug wire off, or you stretch the spark, this is going to go up just like that does. If what goes this way won't go that way. So if this goes taller, this is going to be shorter, like that. Like for example, this one guy that was doing this racing business on his car, he was just horsing around building himself something, and he says, whenever I gap my spark plugs wide enough so that it idles like it's supposed to, it starts cutting out when I hit about 10,000 RPM. He's running, I guess, MSD ignition, I don't know, yeah, but, and I said, well, I said, if you gap your spark plugs closer, it won't idle quite as good, and it may not start quite as good, but you won't be cutting out at your higher RPM, and that's the way he started setting his plugs. He set the plug gap a little bit closer. Now, when I was doing a tune-up, I would always set the plug gap a little bit wider than what it called for, because it's going to start better and idle better with a new spark plug with that slightly wider gap. Now, the ones that burn out, that wear out, they're rounded. You see what I'm saying? They're all rounded off and everything, and they've got only one of the closest place on the plug is where it's always going to try to jump, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. My dad used to teach me all that. You might notice this capacitor right here is your condenser, basically, and it's going to, whenever those points close, then the current flows from the battery through this winding here, and that winding there saturates this winding, and then whenever you break that, this capacitor keeps the spark from burning up the points here and stores some energy, right? Okay, so it stores that energy, And then whenever you're whenever this collapses, it causes that spark to jump and it goes through the spark plug and you get a pop right there and it gives you your ignition. Now the scissor gears on these Toyota Camrys, like in the late 90s vintage, one of my students, this is actually two gears that are made together, like a main gear and a sub gear, and in between these two gears, you might notice there's a snap ring right here, there is a spring in there. And if you pull that camshaft out of there, this is actually, the gears for the timing belts are out here, and this gear in here drives that other camshaft. So you got dual overhead cam, but there's only one gear on the outside on those Toyota Camry engines. All right, and so that bolt right there is supposed to be put in this gear and tightened up before you ever pull that camshaft out of there. If you don't do that, then that spring is going to snap these teeth over to where they look like they're still lined up, but that spring-loaded aspect of the scissor gear won't work. And when you put it back together, if you didn't put that bolt in there to hold it and then take it out after you put it back together, them scissor gears are not going to work right, and you're going to hear under the valve cover, you're going to hear noise because you didn't actually hold the scissor gears in place. Now, it's not too terribly hard to reload the scissor gears and then put the bolts in there, so it's not the end of the world, but you're going to hear a big ugly racket whenever you start that thing up if that scissor gears have unloaded themselves because you pull that gear out of there. See, camshafts are hard to turn. They get hard and easy and hard and easy and hard and easy, and when you're using a lot of the camshafts use phenolic gears, and they had plastic chain, plastic timing gear. They had aluminum timing gears with plastic teeth on them because they were lighter and the chain didn't stretch as much whenever you were, running an engine like that. But everything is all about keeping it quiet. On the old Volkswagen Bugs I was talking about, there were like 11 different camshaft grinds with slightly different angles, and they went from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negative. And when you were building that engine, you were supposed to put a camshaft in there, so there was absolutely no gear lash at all. And if you didn't have any gear lash, then you wouldn't have that noise. But if you put it in there with a little bit of gear lash because you didn't, you just used the same camshaft, or you didn't, set it up so there wasn't any lash, and those Volkswagen engines would be really, really noisy because you didn't set up the, the cam gear lash and all that. But this is all about that. That was pretty ingenious that Toyota, Lexus uses that, I'm sure there's other manufacturers that use scissor gears that I didn't know about. You see the leak on this compressor, and it's pretty easy to see, wasn't it? Compressors are a really common leak point on a lot of vehicles. Whenever they start leaking, they'll leak where the compressor is put together. My rule of thumb is whatever is working the hardest in the most hostile environment is typically what's going to fail first. Like it'd be the fuel tank sending unit's going to fail before the gauge in the dash will, because this got this gas sloshing around, the temperatures are changing all the time, that kind of thing. The compressor's working his rear end off, and so it's going to wind up giving you trouble leaking and stuff a lot of the time before anything else does. Not every time, but a lot of the time. So on this was on a Jeep. We wanted to see how this was doing. This was orifice tube look. The orifice tube on that Jeep was built into the high pressure line. And so what we did was, whenever we took this cutter and we cut that open so we could look at that orifice tube and see what it looked like, and it was horrible. So a lot of the time, even if you can't change the orifice tube by itself, you need to change that high pressure line to make sure you're getting a good clean orifice in there. That's just the way they set that thing up. If I remember right, that was a Jeep Cherokee or Grand Cherokee or something like that. But anyway, I wanted to show you that. Well, that's going to be the end of the video for today, and I hope I hadn't talked your ear off and made you bored. So give me some feedback and tell me what you think about this stuff. And thank you guys for watching and making comments. And I'll see you next time.